10:30 Eastern, and let's get started. Thank you all for joining us today. Good morning, and I am Harsha Rajasimha. I am the host and the moderator for today's discussion. I have with me eminent panel of speakers. Most of you probably already know all of them and don't need any introduction. My background is I'm the founder CEO of Jeeva Informatics and also the founder chair of the Indo-US Organization for Rare Diseases. I'm a genomics data scientist by training, having gone through National Institutes of Health in my postdoctoral career. I have been a social entrepreneur on a mission to accelerate therapies and diagnostics for rare diseases for the last 8 years. So I'm happy to put together this event for all of you today on accelerating the relay from patient registry to natural history studies to global clinical trials to long-term follow-up for rare diseases. So some quick housekeeping stuff. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel. Registrants will receive a link by email as well, and it will be posted on social channels afterwards. But please do take advantage of the opportunity for live interactions throughout the event by posting your questions in the chat box at any time. And we have a session for question and answers, plenty of time, I think about 1 hour for a panel discussion after the initial presentations by all the speakers. Also be prepared to respond to a poll. We'll bring up a poll in the next 5-10 minutes. But otherwise, please stay muted at all times to avoid any background noise. The agenda for today is I'll start off with a brief opening remarks from my perspective, sharing my thoughts on the topic. And then we will have our speakers today, all 4 of them presenting their perspectives, and they'll be introducing themselves, their organization, followed by about an hour of discussion. So keep your questions coming. So let's start off with the patient journey in rare disease, right? As we all know, in the rare disease community, patients with rare diseases spend about 7 years on an average in the undiagnosed state, not knowing exactly what disease they have or they carry. And so once they do have a diagnosis, they consider themselves lucky if there is any FDA-approved treatment, because only 5% of the treatment diseases have any treatment options. And if there are no FDA-approved therapies, the next best thing that can happen is that there is a ongoing clinical trial into which they can potentially enroll and access life-saving treatment options. And then once they get the treatment they need, after that it's about long-term follow-up, monitoring how they are responding to treatments on an ongoing basis. So diagnosis, and to be able to prepare a rare disease community towards clinical trials, they first, NIH and FDA recommend that you have a proper contact registry, a demographic registry, and a natural history study, which collects data related to the disease etiology and physiology over long periods of time, sometimes 5, 10, 15 years, so that we understand it, the scientists can have a solid understanding of the basis of the disease and the symptoms and genetics of the disease. Currently, there are about 2,000 rare disease clinical trials that are registered on clinicaltrials.gov globally, which is very encouraging. From once being a neglected rare disease area, today it's a thriving industry. Although many of these drugs may not be profitable, they are still therapies that are life-saving for diseases that affect even one patient, like we saw with a case of Mila and Jesse in the last year. There are enough clinical trials going on right now. So when you start, if you're a patient foundation or an individual patient affected by a rare disease, you want to either think about being part of a registry that already exists, and that would be ideal instead of duplicating it. But if a registry does not already exist, you want to create one. But when you do start off on a mission to create a patient registry or collect data about patients, about their genetics and their disease and symptoms, the key considerations include what is the purpose of collecting this data, right? The end goal for most patient groups is ultimately having a treatment option for the community that for that particular disease. And if that's the goal, we want to make sure we aggregate. First of all, patient populations are likely to be very small, and we want rich data sets, high quality data sets, and whether clinicians are going to enter the data or patients or both, whether a clinical study protocol for data collection is approved by an institutional review board, or are you just going to collect contact information without an IRB first? Are you going to be informing all your patients about the intended uses of the data? And also, one of the very important consideration is who owns the data. Although individual patients may have the right to share or not share their individual data sets, the aggregate data can still be stewarded or governed by a sponsoring organization. So you want to see how you want to manage those expectations and fitting the data collection process into the lifestyles of the users. Sometimes it's the patients themselves, sometimes it's the caregivers and the family members. And what is the size of the population? What is the distribution of your patients? Is it global? What are the language requirements? Are there any accessibility requirements like visually impaired users that may need to be supported, for example? And what is the expected usage of your system in terms of survey-based data collection, informed consents? What is the overall size of the data? How do you expect it to grow over a period of time? What is the duration of this data collection study, etc.? And one thing to remember here is that this is not entirely a technology problem. It's a people problem primarily, and second, the process, and you do need to follow a high quality process to achieve high quality registry. And technology is only a part of the solution, not the solution. However, selecting the right piece of technology is going to be a critical foundational element to enable you to have the right combination of choices and flexibility necessary to adapt, because nobody can foresee 5, 10, 15 years with precision, but you can make educated and informed guesses. But then you also need to start on a solid foundation so that you can change your combination of choices. You may start off with certain assumptions, and those assumptions may change, etc. And so from a technical and software standpoint, you want to make sure you pick the very flexible options that you have, whether the types of devices you want to support in collecting data, whether it's entirely browser based. Do you expect your users to entirely engage remotely, or is there going to be any in-person interactions at annual meetings, in the clinics regularly, etc.? As well as you don't want to pay for what you don't need. There are a lot of sledgehammer solutions out there. If you are a patient foundation, you don't want to buy something that you don't use. So you want to be able to only use the features and pay for only what you need. So ultimately, my thought is that human-centered design is the most crucial element here, and making sure all the human aspects are covered in these technology pieces, because technology for the sake of technology is not going to be useful, particularly in the rare disease community, particularly in long-term clinical trials or registry studies. So with that, let me give a very quick overview of what we do at Jeeva with the human-centric clinical research software platform that enables the type of flexibility that I was just talking about. So let's watch this very brief video and then we will get to the next speaker.
Attention clinical investigators, study coordinators, CROs, and clinical trial sponsors. If you're planning a patient study within the next 6 months, speed and efficiency are your main concerns. Most clinical studies stall at the earliest stages due to slow study startup, low patient recruitment, poor eligibility screening, the logistical burdens of the informed consent process, and other roadblocks. That's because traditional site-based studies still expect patients to visit clinical centers many times in order to participate. Also, clinical researchers often use a variety of specialized tools to screen patients, communicate with participants, and coordinate study data across the research team. Toggling between these ineffective tools wastes time and effort worth millions, which is why over 30% of clinical studies fail at the enrollment stage. Don't let common pitfalls terminate your next study. There is now a smarter way to recruit patients and manage several study sites from a single, scalable, web-accessible software. When you manage your clinical study with Jeeva, you can recruit more patients faster from diverse geographics and increase your study's chances of success. Jeeva's cloud-based service adapts to your unique patient population and study needs. When you choose Jeeva, you can design studies that fit into your patients' lives and their pockets. With a hybrid study design, your participants will travel less. And with a Jeeva decentralized study, your participants won't need to travel at all. Finally, the follow-up process can follow your participants wherever they are, and you can manage your clinical team and study data wherever you are. Whether you want to start recruiting patients this year or this week, you and your clinical team can get started with a 30-day license to use Jeeva at no cost. After that time, you can choose the Jeeva package that best fits your study, or cancel and receive your complete study data absolutely free of charge. Visit jeevatrials.com for a demo and start your Jeeva study today. Want more? Follow hashtag JeevaTrials for expert advice on how to decentralize your clinical studies with Jeeva. Clinical studies at your fingertips.
And so if you'd like to learn more or like to get a software demo or a free consultation, please make an appointment. You can text RARE 2021 to Charlene on the chat box. Charlene is with Jeeva and she can assist you with getting that set up. We did have a promotion of RARE 2021 and we have exceeded that, but we have extended that due to a lot of demand from the patient foundations. So please take advantage of this offer. So with that, let me launch a poll before handing it over to Eric on this, just so we understand who is in the audience today. With respect to the type of organization you are from and the type of patient registry or clinical studies that you anticipate coming up this year. So the poll should be on your screens. Please take a moment to respond. I'll allow another 10 seconds or so. All right, let's end the poll and take a look at the results. You all should be seeing the results now. 63% nonprofit foundations and a long tail of biotech sponsors, CROs, academia, technology solutions companies, and government 2%, and everybody else 7%. And about 65% of you are looking to start a patient registry or a natural history study this year. That's great. And quite a few of you also thinking about clinical trial phases 1, 2, 3, or real world evidence. So that gives a good understanding for all of our speakers this morning on what how to customize their messaging. Thank you for responding to the poll. With that, it's my pleasure and honor to welcome and introduce our speakers this morning. Our first speaker is Dr. Eric Sid. He's the program director at the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences at the National Institutes of Health. He's a presidential fellow and has been a lead on launching numerous rare disease registry related programs, toolkits, and numerous other initiatives. So it's my pleasure and honor to welcome Eric to the panel. Eric, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, great. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. So give me one moment.
Sure. I have it on my screen, Eric.
Oh, okay. Oops. Sorry. So I'll go ahead and just use off my slides then, if that's okay. So again, my name is Eric, and I'm a program officer within the Office of Rare Diseases Research at NCATS, which is the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences. It's one of the many different institutes and centers that we have at the National Institutes of Health, or the NIH. The NIH is your primary federal agency within the US government that funds research as a whole. And specifically within the NIH, our center, NCATS, focuses on translational science, which is really about how do we translate between different areas within research. So much of my my discussion today with you in this presentation is going to focus really on the language of science and just laying a foundation so that the other speakers are able to build on that. When we talk about the different stages of research, oftentimes some of the language we'll be using involves terms such as basic research or preclinical research or clinical research, eventually thinking about implementation and public health. Much of this, when you look at the science itself and what's involved in it, for clinicians, this is really about etiology or pathophysiology, or ultimately creating a therapy and having guidelines. But that's really oftentimes confusing for patients and patient groups to understand. For patients, really this entire process is about trying to understand what's the cause of my disease. What are my symptoms due to this disease? Are they the same as others? Are they something to expect in the future from this? Is there a diagnostic process to this? Is there a clear test? Is there a lab that I can use, or an imaging study, or a finding on my exam that tells me whether or not I have this disease? And ultimately, how do I gain access to any of those therapies? And what does this mean in terms of my prognosis or expectations of my life? Sometimes the difficulties with patients and patient groups in terms of being able to engage in research is understanding how science is built altogether. When you're trying to move a disease from this state of observation and what you can see into intervention, or what we're doing in terms of trying to either stop the disease from progressing or creating, therapies or procedures that can help alleviate some of the symptoms, what we're ultimately trying to generate from this entire scientific research process is really data to support the uses of those therapies, those drugs, or those techniques, or different other types of resources to actually create that change. So underlying all of this interaction, all of these different terms here, is really data. That's what progresses research forward. And if you think about that from that angle, and understanding that 65% of you are entering the space of thinking about a registry, or starting to think about a natural history, really from a patient group angle, what a registry ultimately is about translating stories of your patient community into data. Again, data is what drives research forward. And the question here is really about how do you collect that data, and where do you store it, and what types of data are you looking for? So what exactly is a registry with that in mind? A registry, and this definition comes from our colleagues at the Agency for Healthcare Quality and Research, or AHRQ. Registries are an organized system to collect uniform information. And again, uniform information is a good way to really just to describe data with a defined purpose, target population, and method. Oftentimes, we talk about this both in terms of who's providing the data. Is it coming from the participants in terms of the patients or caregivers that are filling out the information? Is it coming from the clinicians that may be actually working with those patients and putting in information into a registry? As well as what types of information they're trying to collect. Is it contact immigration, demographics, medical background and history, or actual clinical data coming from evaluation when they're doing an examination with you in terms of labs, or what's in your EHR, your electronic health record? How is that all kind of collected together? And what a registry does is it takes all of this information into a platform and allows you to collect information, again, in a systematic way for multiple people across your entire disease population. So registries are really tools to collect data. And I think the main thing to kind of keep in mind with this is, again, there are many different types of data. The key here is really understanding what is it you need to lay that foundation for the future of your disease in terms of science. So oftentimes, when we talk about this entire process, we talk about small elements, individual clinical trials, patient preference data, or patient experience data, or biomarkers, pathophysiology concepts. we oftentimes focus on one part of the entire equation when much of this is really based on what is your research agenda for your organization and for your patient population. Is there a specific goal you have in mind, whether it be trying to create new therapies, having a new diagnostic, or establishing a diagnostic in the first place, and better understanding quality of life? Much of this stems from really creating that foundation. So having a clear research agenda in mind, and then using that as a way to then guide any of the actual studies you're going to do and the data that you're going to use. Those act as pillars to really build on future studies you may be wanting to then initiate. So ultimately, if your goal is to try to create, again, a new therapy, then you need to have all of this foundation built up before you can do this. And that's oftentimes where registries come into this, is really trying to provide that foundation, either to help with recruitment in terms of your clinical trial, to help in terms of providing comparator data, or to provide information to help understand what patients are needing out of those therapies. So this is kind of just a big overarching picture of what's on the landscape that you're having to do and how registries fit in this. But I think one thing to in particular remember is that this is really about a marathon, not a sprint. So when we talk about the entire process of going from taking a compound and thinking about a drug that you can develop from that, oftentimes this can take years, up to 13 years on average, 10 to 13 years to develop that drug. And this is not linear. Sometimes you'll go through this, you'll fall back, and not all trials will work out. So that's the thing to keep in mind when you're building this entire process, this entire house in some ways. That foundation that you're laying with your registry, with your natural history, is helping you build out all the tools that you need so that if you go through this marathon, you've done the workout plan, you've built all of the different exercise routines, all of the habits that you need in order for you to actually succeed. And this is not about one single event, but a marathon of different events. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste into the chat some resources, and I'm going to hand it over to Scott to kind of pick up from there.
Thank you so much, Eric. That was a great presentation. Thank you for sharing those insights and the valuable resources provided by National Institutes of Health. It's my pleasure and honor to welcome our next speaker, Scott Schliebner from PRA Health Sciences. Scott has been a global advocate for rare disease patients over the years and also Senior Vice President at PRA Health. Take it away, Scott.
Well, thank you, Harsha, and thank you, Eric. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. Really happy to be with you today, and thank you very much for joining us. Yes, Harsha says I'm a Senior Vice President. I lead PRA's Center for Rare Diseases. I started our center about 8 years ago, before rare diseases were becoming the sexy hot topic that they are today. And during this time, we've had a lot of great broad exposure to so many different types of programs, trials, registries, natural history studies. I've been personally very focused and very passionate about removing the barriers that we find in clinical development, trying to eliminate and reduce the burdens, and to try to move us, quite frankly, into the 21st century. The way we conduct clinical trials has not evolved much in many decades, and we can do better, and patients can't wait. And we have the ability to leverage both a patient-focused mindset as well as some technology to make this easier for patients. So with that, I'd like to share a couple slides in talking about changing this paradigm. Could we move forward to the next slide, please? Well, as we pull the slides back up, there we go. Thanks so much. So a quick little flow here of what a traditional clinical drug development paradigm looks like. What really is the way we've designed and conducted clinical trials, again, for several decades here. So kind of starting up in the upper left with an approved protocol and going clockwise around this. I like to say sometimes we develop clinical studies in a conference room in New Jersey, right? And it's sometimes very much a bubble that we design studies in that don't often consider a lot of other factors outside of that or the impact on other stakeholders. Once we get a protocol approved, we typically roll this study out to clinical sites and investigators and select them and recruit them and look for them to participate. Once we have sites on board, we move towards this approval process through IRBs and ethics committees that many of you, I'm sure, are painfully aware of. Once approved, we flow into recruiting participants and looking for patients to participate. And then we just continue this flow of data gets entered and reviewed, analyzed, eventually presented and published. And ultimately, when we get to sort of the end of the spectrum or the end of the marathon that Eric referred to, data is filed and registrations are obtained, and we have an approved new therapy. This is kind of the traditional paradigm. This is how it's been for several decades, and there are some issues with this. Can we go to the next slide, please? So what's exactly wrong with this picture of this traditional paradigm? Well, first off, was this protocol designed with input from either site staff or patients? We usually finalize a protocol and then we send it out to clinical sites. They're a key stakeholder in the process, and their ability to conduct the study and just even manage the different assessments and schedule of evaluations, it's critical for sites to have some buy-in and some input into that. This schedule of assessments is often not realistic for patients in terms of what we're asking patients to do in terms of time requirements and schedules. Down below here, do these patients actually exist? And by this, I mean, sometimes we're thinking about a clinical protocol in a bubble sometimes. And when we're thinking about that, we're looking for maybe this ideal profile of a patient. And we're outlining inclusion and exclusion criteria and eligibility criteria for these patients. A lot of times, those criteria and criterion that we line up make it so that these patients we're looking for don't really even exist out there. We're looking for an artificial patient that isn't realistic. We're on the right side, a couple other problems with this traditional paradigm is, does the study even appeal to patients? Are we measuring things that are important to patients? Do we have endpoints selected that are relevant to what a patient or a caregiver is seeing day to day? A lot of times the endpoints themselves are designed for regulators or for drug developers. And if we're looking for someone to participate in a trial, we should be thinking about what's appealing to them. And lastly, how burdensome will participation be? A lot of times the schedule of assessment is this ideal world of all of the different time points and evaluations we want. And we're not necessarily thinking about, is this an option for patients? Are we asking too much of them? So, lastly, the sort of rhetorical question here is, well, why can't we just continue to do things the way we always have? Why do we really have to evolve? Well, if we can move to the next slide, I'd like to share just a couple quick metrics that suggests this pattern, this paradigm, this model that we've been stuck in for a few decades really is not working anymore. So on the left side of this slide, you'll see a couple different metrics, and on the right side, the impact of these metrics. And just to quickly highlight a couple, overall, not just rare diseases, but overall in terms of clinical development, we're looking for 40 million patients worldwide to participate in 300,000 clinical trials. Harsha mentioned there's about 2,000 active rare disease studies, but every year we're looking for more and more patients to enroll in more and more trials. The downstream effect of this, 50% of trials are delayed due to recruitment. As you move down kind of the left, some of these other metrics, patient retention is a huge issue. This costs money and takes time. The majority of patients live more than 2 hours from a research site or center, and they are unhappy with the location of the center. As a result, more than 30% of patients drop out before a study ends. And I think we all understand the implications of that if we don't collect enough data or we don't complete enrollment or get enough safety data, studies have to be repeated. And lastly, and maybe really the take-home point here, is that travel to and from a clinical site is the most significant burden for rare disease patients. Via the patient surveys we've conducted, this is the number one burden. This makes it difficult to participate. This results in delays in enrollment and retention. So the current brick and mortar travel to a clinical site landscape, really the pre-COVID model, has a lot of challenges to it. And these metrics kind of outline and justify why we need to evolve a little bit more. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So what do the patients think? So we actually reach out and we speak to patients and we ask patients what they think, which I know, what a crazy novel idea. What are the biggest barriers you faced when participating in a trial? So for those rare disease patients who have actually had the choice and the benefit of being in a trial, the biggest barriers they faced were travel, time commitment, financial strain. It does cost money often to participate in a study. There may be reimbursement involved, but sometimes that can take time to be reimbursed. And families often have to outlay money to sort of participate and handle travel, etc. And there's additional strain on family and caregivers above and beyond the typical strain that is already there baseline for caring for someone with a rare disease. So the flip side of our survey, for those patients who have not participated in a clinical trial, which is the far majority of rare disease patients where there just have not been any studies available, some of the criteria we talked about earlier, eligibility, patients don't meet this very narrow scope of inclusion-exclusion criteria. Number two, clinical trial is no longer enrolling. We see biotech and pharma sponsors want to quickly open up a study and enroll it in 6 months and then close it down and analyze the data. We need to allow an opportunity for investigators to communicate that study, for patients to enroll, and the clock is always ticking, but sometimes we need to give patients a little more opportunity. And then, lastly, the trial site was too far away. So again, travel and time being the primary issue here. So this is what patients think. These are the barriers and the hurdles that we see from patients when we speak directly to them and we ask them about their opinion. Let's move to the next slide. Thank you. So moving forward into what is the 21st century now, our paradigm that we've been stuck in really needs to evolve. As Harsha mentioned earlier, this is not all about technology. This is not just a software solution. This is first thinking about patients and really adopting a patient-centric mindset first and foremost. What are we asking of patients? Is this realistic? Is this time frame and schedule of evaluations something that we could do? Could we take time off of work every single week to go to a clinical site? Number two, moving downward here, involving patients and advocates in the design. Before those studies are finalized, before we have these hurdles to overcome that results in enrollment delays and issues with retention, including patients and advocates and caregivers up front to sort of pressure test, is this realistic for us? Can we handle this? Is this appealing to us? That would be key. That is a new part of the paradigm that needs to be part of our thinking. We still have people we work with that have this mentality of, if you build it, they will come. So, borrowing from the Field of Dreams movie, we have a new therapy. Patients would just be lucky to take our drug. They'd be fortunate to be able to participate in this study. They'll come from wherever they can. Well, patients have choices. Patients have preferences. Patients also have constraints in their life. And this idea of, if you build it, they will come, needs to be adjusted so that we can actually not make things challenging for patients, but actually design it around patients. So over on the right side here, what are some of the other things we can do? Well, we can leverage technology. And again, I'd like to emphasize, it's really about a patient-centric mindset, first and foremost, thinking about patients. But we do have technology at hand that can help bring these studies directly to patients. Decentralized trials is really the wave of the future. We can also learn from other industries. Clinical research, again, has been fairly archaic. And if we look outside into consumer health or technology, we see companies that focus every effort of theirs on their ultimate customer and their ultimate stakeholder. In our case, in clinical research, we don't develop new therapies, we don't advance science without the participation of patients. They are the ultimate stakeholders. I know that I'm probably preaching to the choir with the audience we have here, but we can learn from other industries so that we can always be thinking about human-centric designs and always thinking about patients from the get-go. Let's move forward to the next slide. I'd like to share a little bit of a one step towards trying to build a solution to overcome these barriers. So the idea of including patients in the design is key, by focusing more on patients, we can improve access, improve enrollment, and improve retention. So we've developed at PRA, with the help of a couple of the attendees, it looks like on this call, a new toolkit, a patient-centric drug development toolkit that is something available for anyone that would like to use it for free. It's valuable to sponsors, to patients and participants, and also to patient advocacy organizations. There's 4 key parts of this toolkit that you can see in the lower left here. We have a patient-centered protocol development tool. We have a patient involvement value case studies, essentially a dossier that shows the ROI of designing studies that are patient-focused. So if you have colleagues that don't quite buy into why we should think about patients, at the end of the day, it'll also save them money. So there's an argument to be made for them there. We also have a rapid study burden assessment tool. We also have a guide for sponsors on how to speak with participants, what questions to ask them, and also for participants to ask of sponsors, what are some support options that I could receive? What are some things that I could ask if I'm considering participating in a clinical trial? So we're trying to guide patients and sponsors together to meet in the middle and help us develop something that's patient-focused. This is a new patient-centric drug development tool developed by PRA's Center for Rare Diseases, as well as by PRA's Rare Disease Advisory Committee. We'll be releasing this at Rare Disease Day in about 10 days. And again, this is available to anyone who would like to test drive this or try this out. So feel free to reach out to me whenever it's convenient for you. And let's move on. I think I have one last slide just to sort of summarize kind of where we're going here. Thank you, Harsha. So again, by reducing the burden of clinical trials, by thinking about studies differently, we create greater clinical trial access. The CTTI paper on the left does a great job of outlining some of the impact of this, and again, the ROI. This new paradigm, 21st century thinking, really begins with thinking about patients and then leveraging some technology. And it's really that combination that will allow us to design studies that are suited for patients. It allows us to bring studies to patients in their home. It eliminates their #1 burden, which is travel and time. And it also helps us with some other issues. Diversity and access and inclusion in clinical research has been pretty dismal historically. Your typical clinical trial participant looks like me. He's a middle-aged white guy. So by adopting some technology and allowing broader access, we can also access and provide opportunities for patients regardless of ethnicity, gender, sex, geography, whether they're in a rural or an urban setting. So it really democratizes clinical research, which is, of course, better science. It's the right thing to do, and it really brings new therapies to everyone while lowering timelines and costs. So this is the idea, and this is the mindset we want to be moving forward with, is patient-centric, along with leveraging some technology that's been here all along for us to use. So this is the idea as we move forward, and I'd like to thank you for your time. And I see some questions coming in. Thank you for your questions as well. With that, I believe I think I'll turn it over to Tom from here.
My pleasure to welcome Thomas Hester. Tom is a long-time executive in Biotech. They particularly focus on rare disease and biomarket. Tom, there's this background. Take it away, Tom.
Thank you, Harsha. I don't know about the rest of you. I had a bit of a hard time hearing Harsha, so I'll give a little introduction on the next slide, please. So I've had the privilege of working in rare diseases from the research and we'll call it the sponsor side, working at biotech companies and working at every stage of development. Eric did a nice job of describing those stages in the different terminology that different people might understand. But I've worked in the lab, I've worked in process development, manufacturing area, clinical development, and then post-approval of a medicine, there's still a lot of work to do. And I think that sometimes we forget that there's there's a lot of learning to be done after a new medicine comes out as well. Just to highlight where I'm coming from, my perspective is a lot of experience with BioMarin and Audentes. BioMarin has developed quite a few chronic therapies that are usually the first drug for any of these diseases. Some of them are highlighted here. And Audentes is a gene therapy company focused on neuromuscular diseases. Since working at those, I now do some consulting working at gene therapy companies focused on rare diseases. To highlight some relevant programs, I think Bernura is a good one. There, as Eric presented the foundation, having a clear research agenda and some clear natural history really did pave the way for strong development. That product was approved with a natural history as a comparator. There was no placebo arm in that clinical study. And these other programs, I think, highlight that a lot of these diseases affect children as well. So one of the other challenges that comes with these treatments is you're studying them for a long time. You're trying to understand the perspective not only of the patient, but also their caregiver and their family. And those patients are growing and changing with, as they should, as they grow. And so things change. What you need to measure changes. What the expectation is changes alongside their disease changing. The last point I'll bring up, I had an interesting experience working on an in vitro diagnostic. And I think a lot of what we talk about is new medicines, but really we should broaden that. And anything we're talking about here does apply to any type of medical intervention. It could be a medical device. It could be, some other form of therapy that may come into play. All of these build on that same foundation. And as most people have talked about, there's a partnership between patients and companies and researchers and physicians throughout the entire development cycle. When I think about how, from a company perspective, what we think about patients being engaged and how that helps us, it really does provide value throughout that development cycle. Early on, we're learning from the natural history about what the patients need and what is currently being done. So that highlights where there could be improvements. Importantly, like Scott said, sometimes selecting patients, you want to find patients that exist. If your inclusion criteria says they must be under 3 years old, but the average age of diagnosis is 5.5, you're going to have a problem. So really understanding that even the simple metric of what's the average age of diagnosis can be really useful and important for developing a clinical study. During clinical development, it's fairly obvious to look to patients to find out what are relevant outcomes and meaningful outcomes. And unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. I think that's what Scott brought up very nicely, that partnership early on can really make your study better. And then long term, we're looking at this commitment for a long time. Most of these type of diseases are chronic diseases. Most of these treatments are chronic treatments. And it's really important to see what the long-term outcomes are. And long-term could be 10, 15, 20 years. In a lot of these cases. And I think there's a new perspective on the types of information that constitute real world evidence. I think there's a lot of creativity being implemented now, and we have to do it smartly to have good quality data that's meaningful and important both to the patients, but also to companies, regulators, payers, et cetera, in what is important for those patients. Next. I think that's my final note as we introduce this discussion is that long-term engagement is critical to succeed. We're involved in studies that the protocol itself is 5 or 10 years. And in most cases, we want to understand the impact of a new treatment or a new therapy for much longer, for the lifetime, really. And how do we understand that? We have to have a partnership, and we have to have patients and families that are willing to be a part of that journey all the way through. And I will say the longitudinal data. So that's another term that you may hear. What that means is data that's collected consistently on the same patient over time. That's the most valuable at all stages, and it's the most difficult to achieve. It is really, really important to have, but very difficult to have. So we're constantly aiming for consistency, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tom. Hopefully my audio is coming through better now. Zoom had changed my audio from headphones to speaker without notice. Sorry about that. It's my pleasure and honor to welcome our next speaker, Annie Kennedy. She has been a force in the rare disease space, advocating for muscular dystrophies at the Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy Foundation, as well as at the Cure SMA Foundation, and currently at EveryLife Foundation. More than 20 years of contributions in the rare disease advocacy space. Welcome, Annie, and take it away.
Great, thanks so much, Harsha, and thanks to all of my co-panelists who set this up really beautifully today. I've learned a lot, so thanks to everybody. Next slide. So full disclosure, when Harsha reached out and asked me to be on this panel, I suggested that he probably wanted someone else for the panel, and I actually recommended some colleagues to him. And the reason being that I'm with the EveryLife Foundation for Rare Diseases, and we can go to the next slide. And the EveryLife Foundation is a coalition of patient organizations and other stakeholders, including industry and academics, and we focus on policy solutions. We do not develop registries. And many of you, who I recognize a lot of colleagues and friends who are here today, are members of our coalition and are part of our community congress and help us form the policies that we work on. But I have in my career spent more than 2 decades working on registries through a number of different lenses. And Harsha asked me to spend some time today reflecting on that and some of the work that a lot of our colleagues in this space are doing. So a little bit about who we are, and then what I'll be reflecting on today. So next slide. So for those who may not know, the EveryLife Foundation, as I said, is a coalition organization. We focus on 4 pillars. We focus on accelerating therapeutic development in the rare disease space, access to those therapies, and reducing the diagnostic odyssey through improved technology and newborn screening. And as I said, we focus on policy. And we do it by identifying the spaces and places where patient experience and the patient voice should be present, making room at that table, and bringing patient communities to the table. We don't speak for patients. So I think that's really important. So the next slide. So in my career, I have spent, as Harsha said, several, almost 2 decades with the Muscular Dystrophy Association, the neuromuscular space. I started in the clinical space at that time, and then I had some time as the national director of the ALS division, where I had time working on the national surveillance program for ALS with the CDC, as well as the national surveillance program for the muscular dystrophies. And we spent a lot of time today talking about registries. We haven't talked as much about surveillance, but that's a really important type of data that can inform decision-making. And there are probably some of you here who participate in surveillance programs, sit on steering committees for surveillance programs. So we're talking a little bit about that today. In addition, I've worked very closely on registries in the neuromuscular space, both at MDA and, as Harsha mentioned, at Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy, or PPMD, and also with Cure SMA. I really love how Scott, when he was framing it, talked about the need for a paradigm shift. And I think a number of us use this drug development pipeline when we talk about the drug development spectrum. And we spend a lot of time focused on how we get from discovery, the concepts that are needed to be developed and funded, the animal models, all the way through what I think we spend a lot of time thinking about as the Holy Grail, approvals. And the data that we collect and the patient experiences that we collect with an eye on that prize, that hurdle of the approval, and how we're going to help inform the decision-making around that. And we work with the stakeholders and the partners that we need to help inform that journey and that decision-making, and what are the endpoints and the outcomes that we need. What are, how do we inform the protocols for clinical trials? But next slide. But in truth, and as we learned, I think a little too late in Duchenne, and so some of the hindsight that I'd like to share is that in truth, that pipeline, there's a lot more to it. And what I wish we had spent more time doing, and now we work with a lot of our rare disease partners in doing, is not just thinking about the Holy Grail or the hurdle as being approval, but thinking about also what those within the access environment need to understand about the patient journey and about patient experience, and pulling those values, those outcomes, those data elements into our data collection, into our registries as early as possible, so that we can be collecting that long-term to inform decision-making all along this pipeline. Because in truth, we have lots of different stakeholders that need to understand our patient communities, not just the clinical trialists, not just the clinicians, not just the regulators at the FDA, not just the payers. And as patient communities, we need to be able to collect that data in a way that's going to speak to everybody at different time points. And there are going to be lots of different companies that are going to be interested in that data. And there are going to be lots of different clinical trials with different kinds of inclusion criteria. And each of our patient communities has different subpopulations that will get sliced and diced. But we as patient communities need to be really thoughtful about how we collect that data and make sure that we are communicating with all those stakeholders and ensuring that we are collecting that data in a way that when it comes time to have an approval and a payer starts to look at the data that's collected, we have answers to the questions that they're going to be asking. So the next slide. So all of this sort of gets wrapped up in some terminology that we actually haven't used much today. And so I think a lot of people are probably familiar with these terms, but I think it's important to break them down a little bit. We talk a lot about patient-focused drug development, or PFDD. And these are terms that actually the patient community used for a very long time before they were defined. But they've actually now been defined in legislation and in statute, and they were defined through the last PDUFA cycles and in 21st Century Cures. And what was really amazing about 21st Century Cures is that when 21st Century Cures was signed into law, patient-focused drug development was codified as a part of FDA's mission for the very first time. And that was because of all of the energy that patient communities had put into taking this concept that had been integrated into PDUFA 5 and innovating within it and making this concept permanent and pushing that momentum forward, so that when we got to the next PDUFA cycle and when 21st Century Cures was passed into law, it actually had to then be codified as a part of FDA's mission. And FDA had really wrapped their arms around this concept and integrated it into its decision-making. And the reason that's so important is that means that not only the patient groups that were investing in developing patient-focused drug development tools could continue to do so, but our industry partners that were trying to invest in it were getting the signal they needed to continue to invest in it. And so this momentum that we as communities and partners drive is so critically important. So PFDD is defined as the systematic approach to helping ensure that patients' experiences, perspectives, needs, and priorities are captured and meaningfully incorporated into the development and evaluation of medical products throughout the medical product lifecycle. And then the other term that's used is patient experience data. And that is data that can be collected by any persons. And that's really important because that means it's not data that's just collected by industry or by academics. It can be data collected by patient advocacy communities and patient advocacy groups, and is intended to provide information about patients' experiences with a disease or condition. If we go to the next slide, I provide the list that's broken down even further. And again, this comes from statute and the source is there. And it's data that is intended to inform the impact of disease and treatment of symptoms, patient and caregiver perspectives about potential and curative treatments. And again, it's really important to notice that caregiver perspectives are recognized, views on unmet medical needs and available medical interventions. So that means that just because there might be an approved product on the market does not mean we can assume that that community is checked off, one and done. That means that there is a recognition that there are unmet medical needs in communities, even once the products are approved, and enhanced understanding of the natural history of a disease or condition. Okay, so next. And so here's just a list of examples of those tools. And again, we're spending today really focused on registry data, natural history data, but there are a lot of different kinds of patient-generated data that fall into this category. And many of us here today are collecting and generating this data and working with partners to do so. So benefit risk and patient preference studies fall into this bucket. Any guidances that we may be developing, patient-reported outcomes, the registry and natural history data sets, surveillance data, as I mentioned before, core outcome assessments, testimony from patient communities and clinical experts. So for groups that have had either FDA-led or externally led patient-focused drug development meetings or listening sessions at the FDA, they fall into this category and are considered health economic impact data or economic burden data, sometimes it's referred to, which can include caregiver impact, absenteeism or presenteeism, non-direct and indirect cost data. And some of that data is especially important when you're talking about the access environment, electronic health record data, and ICD codes. And ICD codes are incredibly important for helping track a lot of this data and integrating it, especially within the EHR. Okay, the next slide. And all these slides will be available. The one thing I want to flag is for those who aren't aware, when we had 21st Century Cures, so there were a number of patient advocacy groups that led an effort called a legislative effort called the Patient-Focused Impact Assessment Act. I was one of the groups that helped lead this, and it was signed into law. And what it did was ensure that patient experience data would be formally incorporated into the regulatory review at FDA. So it meant that it was no longer just a nice to have, but it was a need to have, so that when reviewers actually looked at a submission, so a drug company submits a product for review, that any patient experience data that was available to enhance the understanding of how that product might mitigate a patient's experience of their disease was incorporated into that review. And the reviewers had to indicate what data was used in that review. And there was a formalized checklist that was developed. And then that law was passed and then became a section of 21st Century Cures. It's actually section 3001, 3002, 21st Century Cures. And this is what the patient experience data checklist looks like. This is a sample of it being completed. And FDA has actually expanded on how this is used themselves, and there's a lot of work in the space talking about how it can be expanded upon further. But I flag it to say that patient experience data is here to stay and is being expanded on. So as patient communities, this is a really important signal to us that the efforts that we're putting in is not just spinning our wheels. It's incredibly important for us to ensure that we're working with our industry partners, we're working with academic partners, we're working with regulators to ensure that the patient experience, the lived journey of our caregivers and our communities are being fully integrated into clinical trial design, into natural history studies, into regulatory decision-making, and into the access environment. Okay, next. So there are a lot of resources. I know everyone has shared some resources, and hopefully these slides will all be available. And there are a lot of wonderful rare disease groups that are working to empower communities that are looking to start registries, are putting tools and guidebooks together. So I've compiled some of them here. RareX has a wonderful initiative underway. Global Genes has a guidebook that they've put together, as well as a webinar series. If you go to the next slide. PCORnet has a network that they've put together for rare disease partners. There's a Rare Disease Cures Accelerator data initiative being led by Critical Path, funded by FDA, and an initiative through NORD. If we go to the next slide. Eric actually manages this and already talked about it, but it's the NCATS Toolkit. It's not just focused on registries. This is a great place for, if you don't know this toolkit, I recommend everyone go there and look at what's available. This is a really important set of resources for rare disease groups and partners. And then there's an initiative being led by the National Health Council. EveryLife Foundation, IVI, provided some seed funding, but they're looking for other partners to join this effort. But it's to look at essentially the data that came from the patient-focused drug development workshops at FDA and look at how we can transform those narratives and that data into outcomes and impacts, broader impacts, pull that into a shareable database and data set that would be made publicly available. And that's a year-long project that then would be publicly available. So I think that's the end for me. Get on the next slide. Okay. So thank you, everybody, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Annie. That was a great presentation. One of the reasons I chose Annie out of many options or say many leaders in that space who may be more directly involved in patient registries is because she can provide a neutral perspective. Being coming from an organization which has no vested interest in the registries aspect, which exactly what Annie delivered to provide all the available resources out there for the patient communities to look at as unbiased as it can be. So thank you for that. With that, let's open up for discussion and question and answer. So as I look at the questions coming in, let me start off with my first question to the panel, which is, we have a very different set of expectations in terms of the data quality, the type of data collected by a patient foundation in the early stages of forming a patient registry or a natural history study versus the expectations from the FDA in regulated clinical trials on a biotech sponsor, for example, or a CRO collecting data on behalf of a sponsor. So what's your best guidance on how do we plan as a patient foundation to create registries and natural history studies early on in a way that can be consumed by these more regulated clinical trials as a supplement to augment their clinical trial data in terms of the observer-reported outcomes, patient-reported outcomes, or observational study collected. So I'd like to get the perspectives from each one of you as you bring the government, CRO, patient advocacy, and sponsor perspectives. What would be your best guidance to patient groups on how they can start off knowing that the expectations on the quality of the data and the intended users can be different once it gets into clinical trials? Let's start with Eric on this one, and let's move on.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think part of this is understanding when we're talking about, the use of this data. So essentially, a lot of times people will say this is what you would call regulatory grade or quality data. Much of this has to do, again, with understanding your research agenda. So oftentimes people focus on a registry as an endpoint versus registries are really, again, a tool. It's a database. It's a platform to collect your data, to manage it, to store it. And really the key question here is, what is the data driving towards? So for example, if you're starting out and all your focus at this stage is really just starting to get a sense of what is the patient population itself, you may not need regulatory grade data to start, but you really need well-selected data in terms of helping you connect where your patients are, their demographics maybe, their backgrounds. You may not even need data that is specifically, having to even fit into research publications at that point. Because again, if your goal is really just to organize your community, you may not need to share this with outside of your community yet. You may just want to be able to share locations so that when your researchers are thinking about planning a trial, they know how they, if they can access the community at large, if there's certain areas, cities or states or locations that they're available for that trial. Now, again, that's a starting point for some of you that maybe are thinking about how to get started on this. If you're already at that stage where you have your community well organized, and now you're thinking about, actual trials that you're promoting. So again, if you're maybe part of what you're working on right now is a natural history study. The point of a natural history study is essentially trying to get observational data to understand what's the natural course of the disease. In that case, you're really going to need to think about what's the best fit within your community. Is there data that people have already collected? Is there retrospective data that exists? Or is this something that you have the funding to support a prospective trial? In other words, you want to start collecting that data from this point on. So a lot of that has to do with really your organization and your community's resources, as well as what is your priority at this point. So I'm just going to really kind of direct you back to thinking about your research agenda. And I think my colleagues on the panel probably can go more into detail about that. But that research agenda ultimately is going to drive the use of your data. And if your research agenda downstream is to construct, again, regulatory grade data because you want to support clinical trials that are used in creating interventions or therapies, then I think part of it is when you're early in the process, understanding that goal in your research agenda. If that's really where you're going to be aiming, then it may be that that's where you need to direct some of your funding, some of your resources, and understanding the capacity that you're going to need to generate that quality of data. Again, if you don't need that quality of data, that may be a lot of resources that you don't have the room to really spare in your organization to focus on that at this point. But if you are thinking that you're ready, and this is kind of where you're starting to go into with your organization, let your research agenda drive what you want your data to be used for. So the quality should match that purpose.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Scott, do you want to take a stab at this?
Sure. Well, I mean, Eric answered it so well. I think that's a lot of times we talk with patient advocacy organizations, and they've essentially been provided a roadmap of the things they need to do. And the first is you must develop a registry. And I'm not arguing that registries are not helpful, but to Eric's point, they are a tool, right? And so instead of just grabbing a tool, first we should be thinking about what's the thing we're trying to fix, or what is the problem, or what is really the question really at the heart of it. I guess the only thing I would really add to that is we know there's a lot of different organizations out there. There's some small groups just getting started where they are the only organization working within a certain disease state. But there's also others, and I can see a couple here that are still with us on this talk today, where a couple different organizations are focused on the same disease. And I can't tell you how many times we see every organization feeling like they need to develop their own registry or their own natural history study. And I think by combining resources and making sure that we're collecting the appropriate data that is important to a couple different groups, we can work together and collaborate a little bit more, both with industry as well as with some academic researchers, and then hopefully aligning a couple different patient groups together as well. So that would be one other piece of advice, if at all possible, if you can combine your resources and not try to build something independent yourself, but partner with another group perhaps if it's relevant.
Great, thanks, Scott. Tom, Annie, would you like to add something?
Totally agree with what Eric and Scott have said. Looking at what is out there, what's known, if you're in a place where the course of disease, the spectrum of disease is not well understood, that's an area you need to fill the gap. So when we're thinking about, from a company perspective, you're coming in, you need to answer a whole range of different questions about this disease, about how to study it, about how to assess the outcomes. And you take stock of what is available out in the literature, out in the world, what is known, what is not known, and you start filling those gaps. I think a patient group or any other academic group can fill those gaps just as well. So it really does come back to what's the purpose, what's the goal, and then what information can help fill that goal. It doesn't always mean a registry is the answer to it. Then when you do want to have a registry that's going to be used in to help develop a treatment, used by companies, used by regulators, there are very clear standards about what needs to be done. So I think it's not unknowable. It's just a matter of defining what you want to achieve. I totally agree with Eric, put it very well.
Yeah, I agree with defining the research question. I guess I would just add that there can be multiple research questions, and from the perspective of a patient community, we're spending a lot of time, for important reasons, focused on clinical trials and therapeutic development. But for patient communities, registries also can serve other very important purposes, right? They help us understand our diseases better. They help us understand, first of all, they help you not be so alone as a member of the patient community, and you can start to track your child or your symptoms against what else is happening to other people and start to see, oh, that's not an anomaly. That happens to other people 10 years into the disease or 3 years into the disease, or when we're all 18 months old. And you start to realize that these are commonalities. And while we refer to that as natural disease or disease progression, as a parent, that means something different, right? But the other thing is that then can lead to the development of care standards. And so as patient groups, a lot of times what we can then transform the registries into, working with our scientific advisory boards, medical advisory boards, and other partners, is we can develop and drive care standards in our diseases, which can forever change the landscape in our disease spaces. Another thing that a lot of times patient groups are able to do with registries are develop diagnostic algorithms. As it was said at the very beginning, Harsha, I think you said it, we talked about one of the hallmarks of rare disease are oftentimes very long, expensive, unnecessary diagnostic odysseys. And one of the ways to mitigate that are through, unlocking the learnings in registries and natural history studies and looking at what those journeys look like and how we can mitigate them, looking at whether or not there are genetic modifiers. Can this help us lead to newborn screening or other diagnostics? So I think while we are very importantly focused on how informing clinical trial design and regulatory decision-making, there are other really important things that come from registries. I'm struck by the symptom. I think one of the earliest symptoms we all learned about COVID was the loss of taste. Well, that came from the Stand Up to Cancer registry and people listing that they were losing their taste in COVID, like associating that. That came from a patient registry. That's where we first learned that. So really important things come from registries that can sometimes be seen as anecdotes or sidebars, but lead to really important diagnostics. So I would just sort of stir that into the conversation as we think about, from the perspective of a patient community, whether something's worth the investment and how you build that into your decision-making when you're talking to your board and because we all know these are hard, trade-offs that we talk about as far as investments are concerned. There are a lot of things to be weighing when you think about that.
Absolutely. Thank you all for sharing those great perspectives. A couple things that I like to add to that discussion is, one, when you think about some common conditions like diabetes, cardiovascular, and other diseases, you will find a ton of data published about what's the blood glucose levels, various types of data analysis, hundreds or thousands of publications coming on what the patient population looks like, how does the behavior of the disease or progression of the disease varies in certain types of subpopulations and so forth. Whereas when you look at a ultra rare disease, you don't probably have any data at all. And we generally think of drug discovery and development as a process that entirely happens in a laboratory with scientists working with some chemistry and genes and therapy and stuff like that. But ultimately, for that to be successful, we definitely need the patient level data. Whether it's muscular, neurological, blood-related disorders, any others, there is a sample collection to be done, patient opinions and pain levels, all that. So that's the whole point of patient-reported outcomes and caregiver-reported outcomes, right? So and hence, if that such data does not exist at all, it's just in my mind, that's what FDA and NIH recommends is it's very important. Those data cannot be ignored. And so you do need a registry in that sense to collect this type of data, especially when it's a neglected or say unpublished disease. Other than just knowing what gene mutation may be involved, you do need to collect data related to symptoms, the progression of the disease, and so forth, and publish that even. And so collecting that at a high quality is very important. The second part I will also mention is the global aspect of this, right? So we have certain patient foundations that are located in the United States and Europe, which are probably the most mature in terms of having a registry at all for many of the hundreds of these diseases. But patients living outside of these regions, they are not necessarily yet part of these registries. And so it's so important to be part of the registry in the first place. That's when you get discovered when Tom is looking to conduct a gene therapy clinical trial, or Scott is looking to recruit patients into clinical trials. They are likely to go into these registries and natural history databases and look for patients who match the criteria. And so your discoverability is significantly enhanced when you become part of these registries. So I see there are many international attendees on this call as well. So I wanted to make sure this is not all US regulations and policy that Annie described. That's broadly relevant because FDA approved therapies are available to patients in many countries outside of US as well. And hence it's very important that you engage in these registry programs early on, because I had a recent request from a patient in India asking if her child could participate in a clinical trial that's being conducted in the United States. But she, the principal investigator on that clinical trial told me that there is a number of patients who have been in the natural history study for 10 years. And they obviously have to get first preference over someone who is just coming in today, right? And so it's so important that you engage in the registry and natural history studies early on, so you will be, your child or yourself will be picked up in a clinical trial for a gene therapy, which could save the life. Those would be my couple additions to that point. And that's where I see the relay going from being part of registry. How is it going to help me today, right? So it may not help you today. Next year there is a gene therapy clinical trial. Guess where they are going to look first? They are going to look into the registry that exists from various patient foundations that are collecting this patient data. So let's move to the next question from Alan Thomas from Ataxia and Me Group, asking us, I wonder if the panelists have any comments or concerns about patient adherence with the advance of remote trials. Scott, would you like to take that first?
Sure, from my friend Alan. Thanks for the question, Alan. Any concerns about adherence? Well, I think right now adherence and retention is a little bit of a challenge in terms of the barriers we talked about. It's very hard for patients to travel and adhere to a really rigorous schedule. When you move into a decentralized model where patients are participating remotely in a lot of cases, maybe there's an element of home healthcare nursing where there's nurses going physically to a participant's home to take a blood draw or support drug delivery or drug administration, et cetera. That helps a lot. I do think when you move to more of a remote setting, there are less eyes, I guess, in a way, on the patient. There's a little less direct investigator connection, observation, etc. So that does introduce a little bit of a question mark. I think there's some interesting tools now around drug accountability, which is kind of a big one, but also around the ability to have quick telehealth check-ins with an investigator or study coordinator for a trial to be able to, make sure that a patient's feeling connected and getting the communication they want, but also so that the clinical sites who technically are responsible for that patient's participation, so that they have some, a little bit of insight and a little bit sort of closer touch points. So I think it's an interesting question because we want to reduce the burden and make it easier for patients. But in doing so, we also, there also needs to be a little bit of trust built in, I guess, as well. And so we need to make sure that we're supporting patients, making sure that we're keeping an eye on what's happening, so that everyone feels comfortable with the data. So long way of saying, I think that as we move to decentralized, we've got to appropriately kind of balance that out and make sure the right kind of safeguards are in place.
So I'll comment, and this is my cat, by the way, if you're wondering, that in addition to what Scott was saying, I actually don't like the term adherence sometimes too much because, really, as we move towards more of these virtual models, what we really have to think about is taking the lessons from other fields, for example, user experience, in thinking about, are we meeting the needs of our participants in these trials? How do we better facilitate their needs and their access in order to actually drive the success of a trial? Part of this is, making sure that the patients are not just engaged in it, but they're partnered from the beginning, and the trial itself and all of the infrastructure behind it is really designed with that with patients in not just in mind, but as partners in the entire process. So a good example of this is even considering, when you're building out a registry, for example, the platform that you have for it and how people can access it. Are you able to share results? Is there a benefit for the patient, or sorry, the participant themselves in being a part of the registry or being a part of the trial? Can they understand and really be able to see the value, not just for themselves, but also within their disease, and ultimately what's going to happen in the care that they're going to see in their disease long term? So that's part of it, is really not just approaching it from the angle of this is a trial and how do we better get people to do the task for this trial to succeed, but really how do we ensure that the success of the trial is really interconnected with the goals of the patient community and that they are driving the success itself.
Great points. Thank you, Eric and Scott. Tom, did you have a comment?
My first thought was a lot of the challenges with long-term follow-up existed before a lot of this remote, and I think there's a lot of hope. What I hear in discussions is that this shift to having a little bit more remote monitoring or remote visits, physicians are embracing it, patients are embracing it. I'm hoping that maybe we get a little bit more accurate assessment in some areas. We're assessing the patient or in their own home. They haven't been on a plane or a long car ride or a train to get to the site. They're not in an unfamiliar place. So I hope maybe we can get some more real life experience, especially in the long-term view. That's my hope. There also is the challenge that some assessments are very difficult to do that way. So you have to find a different way to assess certain aspects. And I think that's going to take some innovation, some ingenuity, some creativity to figure out how to do that. It's one thing to send a nurse to draw blood. That's the easy solutions. The more difficult are sometimes these advanced neurological exams or assessing, a variety of mobility and things like that, and things where the doctors feel like they have to really examine the patient in person in order to assess. So I think we're going to have to come up with ways to better do that. But I'm actually hopeful that we can get a better assessment of how people are doing long term.
So I would just add, I mean, I think these were all really spot on responses. I think, though, we need to continue to evolve what we consider to be, regulatory grade data collection. Right now, what FDA thinks about is how we feel, function, and survive. And that's really part of what Tom was talking about, the data collection from the clinician. And I think in one of our slides, we talked about real world evidence, and this transition and the ability to use digital health tools and real world data collection will help us move beyond this feel, function, and survive to feel, function, and thrive. Because what we really want to understand is how patient communities are doing in their real world environment, as Tom said, not just in your clinical environment. And many of the measures that are currently collected in clinical trials can't even be done in all clinical spaces. They can only be done in particular clinical spaces. And so I think what we're doing is we're seeing this really important shift to being able to expand clinical trial participation and inclusion to those who can't get to certified clinical trial sites, but could get to their home physician site, by looking at how we modify what we're collecting, and even look at supplemental, secondary, and tertiary endpoints and outcomes that tell the whole story and talk about what's really happening in somebody's life, and whether or not somebody's thriving on a treatment or on a protocol. And we're having these conversations more, and hopefully we'll also start to see more equity in the participation within our trials, because we are opening up participation beyond the certified centers of excellence and sites. On the back end, that may also mean that access is broader once we have broader inclusion and trial participation.
Okay, great. Thank you all. I think we are almost getting close to the end of the session. So let me ask one last question from the audience's side, which is, what percentage of the sponsors are demanding the virtual remote trial paradigm to really facilitate that paradigm shift? Are they really demanding it today or in the last year post-COVID, or is it still a uphill battle to drive the adoption of the new paradigm? And second, are there any good examples of how we are achieving improved patient experience with these remote methods of collecting data? Scott, would you like to take a stab at that real quick, and then we'll wrap it up?
Sure, I'll be fast. Yeah, so I saw the question. I tried to respond a little bit to that. These were models and paradigms that we were pushing forward, talking about with clients for a couple of years, right? And the common sort of summary response was, well, that's interesting. When you've done that 10 times and you have some good data and ROI on that, we'll think about it. And with COVID, though, it's really turned into an accelerant. And so now really every conversation we're talking about with sponsors includes this model, includes this paradigm. And I guess I just wanted to emphasize, this doesn't have to be this dramatic shift, right? We'd kind of like it to be a shift, but it can also just be some baby steps, right? Like eliminate one visit and do it via telehealth, or eliminate another visit and leverage some home health care nursing. And we can start small and take some baby steps and try to get even those hesitant sponsors to sort of start moving in the right direction.
Thank you. Any other quick comments?
Just posted in the chat a resource for the Trial Innovation Network, which is an NCATS funded initiative that basically provides a number of different resources and tools around clinical trials. They do have some around post-COVID now that they've started to adapt to more virtual formats. So you might be able to find some resources there, and they'll continue to populate new ones as they come out.
Okay, So the last question for the panel is, in 30 seconds, describe your magic wand solution to the current challenges. If you were to make a wish for Rare Disease Day, one wish, what would that be?
We will be leading an appropriations effort to see increased funding for rare disease research at NIH and FDA. So that's my shameless plug. I want to see more funding for rare disease research.
Scott?
That'd be great. I guess my wish would be that there was a new potential therapy or curative treatment for all 7,000 plus rare diseases.
Great. Tom?
The optimist in me sounds a lot like Scott, and hoping that there's a scalable solution for these new advanced therapies. The pragmatist in me says, if we can just shift to patients are experts too, and move the goal beyond approval, like Annie was talking about, those I think our goals are right in front of us.
That's a good stuff.
Eric?
I would think of rare diseases as not a single disease focus, but really as a collective. And as much as we can, I think going back to Annie's comment about thinking about equity and inclusion, how can we take best practices and really apply them to everyone in the community equally, and provide opportunities for everyone equally?
Great. And if I can add my wish for this year, Dr. Christopher Austin from NCATS said it's going to take 2,000 years at the current speed of developing therapies to have a treatment for every single rare disease. And that's just not acceptable. That's going to be like, my great grandkids are not going to be alive to see that. And so if we can collaborate more within the rare disease community, across the continuum, within the patient advocacy, sponsors, CROs, and all of us coming together towards this common goal of accelerating therapies for patients with rare diseases, like Scott said, for all 7,000 of them. And how can we accelerate that? By applying people, process, and technology. That would be my wish. If we can all work together to achieve that goal within our lifetimes, I think that will be phenomenal. Even though they may not be curative, even a palliative treatment, at least one treatment for all rare diseases. So with that, I'll conclude this panel discussion. Please feel free to reach out. I'm sorry we did not have the time to get through all the questions, but this is our key takeaways from this panel discussion today, and there were several more. Feel free to reach out to individual panelists as you need more clarifications, and happy to answer any further questions. You can also schedule appointment with Jeeva, as we have been listening to these commentaries from key opinion leaders, individual patients, and we have spoken with over 1,000 patient stakeholders in the rare disease community in developing the Jeeva eClinical Cloud that can be part of the solution. But again, a piece of technology. It does still require people, processes, and collaborations. So thank you. Stay safe and have a productive rest of Rare Disease Month. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Hi, thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.